Harold Thompson adjusted his worn military cap as he walked down the familiar street toward the corner store. At 73 years old, his steps were slower than they used to be, but his back remained straight with the dignity of a man who had served his country with honor. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the pavement as he made his way through the neighborhood he had called home for over 30 years. The old veteran had fought in Vietnam, earning 3 Purple Hearts and a Bronze Star before returning to civilian life. Now, decades later, he lived alone in a small apartment, surviving on his military pension and the occasional odd job he could still manage. His daily walk to Murphy's corner store had become a routine that gave structure to his quiet days. Harold pushed open the glass door of the store, the familiar bell chiming his arrival. Mrs. Murphy, the elderly Irish woman who had owned the place for as long as anyone could remember, looked up from behind the counter with a warm smile. She had always treated the veteran with special kindness, often refusing payment for small items or offering him day-old pastries at no charge. "Good afternoon, Harold," she called out cheerfully. "The usual today?" "Yes, ma'am," Harold replied, his voice carrying the respectful tone that had been drilled into him during his military service. "Just need some milk, bread, and those vitamins the doctor recommended." As Harold moved through the narrow aisles gathering his items, he couldn't help but notice the 3 young men who had entered the store shortly after him. They were in their 20s, dressed in baggy clothes and speaking in hushed tones that made him uneasy. Something about their behavior reminded him of the tension he had felt during night patrols in the jungle all those years ago. The veteran had learned to trust his instincts during the war, and those same instincts were telling him that trouble was brewing. He had seen enough violence in his lifetime to recognize the signs. The way the young men kept glancing at the cash register, the nervous energy in their movements, and the fact that none of them seemed interested in actually purchasing anything all pointed to danger. Harold completed his shopping quickly, paid Mrs. Murphy, and headed toward the door. He hoped his concerns were unfounded, that these were just neighborhood kids killing time on a boring afternoon. But as he stepped outside into the fading daylight, he heard the unmistakable sound of raised voices from inside the store. Through the window, he could see one of the young men had approached the counter while the other 2 positioned themselves near the door. Mrs. Murphy's face had gone pale, and her hands were shaking as she opened the cash register. The veteran's worst fears were being realized. The store was being robbed. Harold's mind raced as he considered his options. He could call the police, but by the time they arrived it might be too late. Mrs. Murphy was a good woman who had shown him nothing but kindness, and he couldn't simply walk away while she was in danger. Despite his age and the arthritis that made his joints ache, the old soldier felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that had kept him alive in combat. He set his grocery bag down carefully on the sidewalk and reached into his jacket pocket where he kept his cell phone. His fingers found the device, but before he could dial, he heard Mrs. Murphy cry out in fear. One of the robbers had apparently grown impatient and was threatening her more aggressively. The veteran knew he had to act quickly. He pulled out his phone and dialed 911, speaking in urgent but controlled tones to the dispatcher. "This is Harold Thompson at Murphy's Corner Store on Elm Street. There's a robbery in progress. 3 suspects, 1 elderly female victim. I'm a military veteran and I'm going to intervene." The dispatcher tried to convince him to wait for police, but Harold had already made his decision. He had sworn an oath long ago to protect the innocent, and that oath didn't have an expiration date. Ending the call, he approached the store entrance, his military training taking over despite the decades that had passed since his service. As Harold pushed open the door, the bell chimed again, causing all 3 robbers to turn toward him. For a moment, everyone in the store froze. The old man stood in the doorway, his weathered face calm but determined, his eyes taking in every detail of the situation with the practiced assessment of a combat veteran. "Let her go," Harold said quietly, his voice carrying an authority that seemed to fill the small space. "Take whatever money you want and leave, but don't hurt the lady." The robber closest to the door, a thin young man with tattoos covering his arms, laughed mockingly. "Look what we got here, boys. Some old-timer thinks he's going to play hero." He pulled out a knife, the blade gleaming under the store's fluorescent lights. "You better turn around and walk away, Grandpa, before you get yourself hurt." Harold didn't move. His eyes remained fixed on the 3 men, calculating distances and angles the way he had been trained to do in the military. He had faced enemy soldiers in the jungles of Vietnam, Men who were better armed and more dangerous than these street thugs. Age had slowed his body, but it had also given him wisdom and the confidence that comes from surviving life's worst challenges. "I said let her go," Harold repeated, taking a small step forward. "This is between you and me now." The atmosphere in the store grew tense as the standoff continued. Mrs. Murphy remained frozen behind the counter, her eyes wide with fear but also with a glimmer of hope as she watched the elderly veteran face down her attackers. None of them realized that this confrontation was about to take a dramatic turn, or that Harold's military service had prepared him for exactly this kind of situation. The veteran's calm demeanor and steady voice had already begun to unnerve the robbers, who had expected an easy target in the elderly store owner. Instead, they found themselves facing a man who showed no fear, whose very presence seemed to command respect and project strength despite his advanced years. The tension in Murphy's corner store reached a breaking point as the three robbers realized the old man wasn't going to back down. The leader, a stocky young man with gang tattoos covering his neck, grew increasingly agitated by Harold's calm resistance. He had expected fear from the elderly veteran, not this quiet confidence that seemed to fill the cramped space. "You're making a big mistake, old man," the leader snarled, reaching into his jacket. "This ain't your fight." Harold's trained eyes immediately tracked the movement, recognizing the telltale signs of someone reaching for a weapon. His military instincts, honed through months of combat in Southeast Asia, kicked in automatically. Time seemed to slow as his mind processed the threat assessment and calculated his response options. "Actually, it became my fight the moment you threatened an innocent woman," Harold replied, his voice remaining steady despite the danger. "I've faced down enemies before, son. You don't scare me." The robber with the knife moved closer, trying to intimidate the veteran with aggressive posturing. But Harold had seen real killers in Vietnam, men who fought for their lives and their country with everything they had. These street criminals, despite their weapons and youth, lacked the discipline and resolve of trained soldiers. Mrs. Murphy watched in amazement as the elderly customer she had known for years transformed before her eyes. Gone was the quiet, humble man who usually shuffled through her aisles. In his place stood someone who radiated authority and competence, someone who had clearly faced life-and-death situations before and emerged victorious. The leader finally pulled out his gun, a cheap pistol that he waved menacingly at Harold. "Last chance, Grandpa. Walk away now or things are going to get real bad for you." Harold studied the weapon and the way the young man held it. The grip was wrong, the stance was amateur, and the barrel shook slightly with nervous energy. This wasn't someone who had extensive firearms training or experience in actual combat situations. It was just a scared kid trying to act tough. "Put the gun down, son," Harold said, taking another careful step forward. "You're in over your head here. The police are already on their way. You can still walk out of here without anyone getting hurt." The words hit the robbers like cold water. They hadn't considered that someone might have called for help before entering the store. Panic began to set in as they realized their simple robbery was turning into something much more complicated and dangerous. "He's bluffing," the one with the knife said, though his voice lacked conviction. "Old man probably doesn't even know how to use a phone." Harold smiled grimly. 47 years in this neighborhood, son. I know every cop, every fireman, and every paramedic in this district. They're probably 3 minutes out, maybe less." As if on cue, the distant sound of sirens could be heard growing louder. The robbers looked at each other with growing alarm, their planned quick grab and run turning into a potential disaster. They had wanted easy money, not a confrontation with police officers. The leader's gun hand began to shake more noticeably as the reality of the situation sank in. He was facing assault charges, armed robbery charges, and now potentially charges for threatening an elderly veteran. The simple score that was supposed to net them a few $100s was rapidly becoming a life-changing mistake. Harold sensed the shift in the room's dynamics. Fear and uncertainty had replaced the robbers' initial confidence. This was the moment when amateurs made critical errors in judgment, when desperation could lead to violence. He had to act carefully to prevent the situation from escalating further. "Listen to me," Harold said, his voice taking on a more paternal tone. "You boys are young. You've made some bad choices today, but it doesn't have to define the rest of your lives. Put down the weapons, let Mrs. Murphy go, and surrender peacefully when the police arrive. Trust me when I tell you that fighting will only make things worse." The veteran's words carried weight because they came from someone who had clearly seen real combat and understood the consequences of violence. Unlike the bravado and threats the young men were used to hearing on the streets, Harold's calm wisdom cut through their panic and made them think about their next moves. The sirens were getting closer now, and Mrs. Murphy could see police lights beginning to flash through the store's front window. The cavalry was coming, but the next few moments would determine whether this confrontation ended peacefully or in tragedy. The robber with the knife looked toward his leader, waiting for instructions. The third man, who had been silent throughout the encounter, was visibly sweating and appeared ready to bolt for the back exit. Their unity was cracking under the pressure of the approaching police response. Harold maintained his position near the front door, effectively blocking their primary escape route while keeping himself between the criminals and Mrs. Murphy. His military training had taught him to control territory and limit his enemy's options, tactics that remained just as effective on a civilian street as they had been in the jungles of Vietnam. "Time's up, boys," Harold said quietly as the police sirens grew louder. "Make your choice now while you still can." The leader's face contorted with rage and desperation as he realized his situation was hopeless. The easy robbery had turned into a nightmare, and the old man standing before him had somehow managed to turn the tables completely. In his anger and panic, he made the worst possible decision. He decided to fight rather than surrender. The gun swung toward Harold as the young criminal's finger tightened on the trigger, but the veteran had been watching for exactly this moment, had seen the telltale signs of a desperate man about to make a fatal mistake. Decades of military training and combat experience had prepared him for this split second when everything would be decided. The moment the gun barrel swung toward him, Harold's decades of military training took over completely. Time dilated as his combat instincts engaged, transforming the 73-year-old man into the soldier he had been in Vietnam. His body moved with a fluidity that belied his age, muscle memory overriding the stiffness of arthritis and the slowness of years. Harold dropped low and lunged forward, his left hand shooting out to deflect the weapon, while his right drove toward the gunman's solar plexus. The move was executed with the precision of someone who had been trained to disarm enemies in close-quarters combat, a skill set that had kept him alive in countless dangerous situations decades earlier. The gun discharged harmlessly into the ceiling as Harold's strike connected, driving the wind from the leader's lungs and sending him stumbling backward into a display of canned goods. The crash of falling merchandise mixed with Mrs. Murphy's screams and the increasingly loud wail of approaching sirens. The robber with the knife reacted to his partner's distress by charging at Harold from the side, the blade aimed at the veteran's ribs. But Harold had fought multiple opponents before, and his peripheral vision caught the movement. He spun with surprising speed, grabbing the attacker's wrist and using the young man's momentum against him. With a move that combined martial arts training with battlefield experience, Harold twisted the knife wielder's arm while pivoting his hip, sending the criminal flying over his shoulder in a perfect throw. The young man hit the floor hard, the knife skittering away across the linoleum as he gasped for breath. The third robber, who had been frozen with shock during the rapid exchange, suddenly bolted toward the back of the store. But Mrs. Murphy, emboldened by Harold's heroic actions, grabbed a baseball bat she kept behind the counter and blocked the fleeing criminal's path. "Oh no, you don't," she declared with Irish fire in her voice, brandishing the bat with surprising authority. "You're not going anywhere after what you put us through." The would-be escapee skidded to a halt, trapped between the determined shopkeeper and the veteran who had just neutralized his two companions. His hands went up in surrender as he realized the futility of his situation. Harold, breathing heavily but still alert, moved to secure the gun that had clattered to the floor. His movements were deliberate and careful, the result of extensive firearms training that had taught him to treat every weapon as potentially dangerous. He cleared the chamber and removed the magazine before setting the pistol safely aside. The police sirens reached their crescendo as multiple squad cars pulled up outside Murphy's Corner store. Through the window, Harold could see officers emerging from their vehicles, preparing for what they assumed would be a dangerous armed robbery situation. He knew he needed to defuse the tension quickly to prevent any misunderstandings. moving slowly to avoid startling the approaching officers. Harold raised his hands and called out in a clear, authoritative voice that carried the unmistakable tone of someone accustomed to command situations. "Officers, this is Harold Thompson, military veteran. The situation is contained. 3 suspects are down and disarmed. 1 elderly female victim is safe. I'm the one who called it in." The lead officer, Sergeant Martinez, had been responding to emergency calls in this neighborhood for over 15 years. He had never heard anything quite like this. An elderly civilian claiming to have single-handedly neutralized 3 armed robbers. As he cautiously entered the store with his weapon drawn, what he saw defied his expectations. Harold stood calmly near the center of the store, his hands visible and his posture non-threatening despite the chaos around him. 2 of the robbers were on the floor, clearly subdued and offering no resistance. The third stood with his hands raised, looking thoroughly defeated. Mrs. Murphy remained behind her counter, still clutching her baseball bat and wearing an expression of fierce pride as she looked at the veteran who had risked his life to protect her. "Sweet Mary and Joseph," she exclaimed to the officers as they surveyed the scene. "You should have seen Harold in action. Those boys thought they could terrorize an old woman, but they picked the wrong store to rob. This man is a genuine hero." Sergeant Martinez carefully assessed the situation, taking in the disabled weapons, the subdued suspects, and the remarkable calm that Harold projected, despite having just been involved in a violent confrontation. The officer had seen plenty of crime scenes, but this was unlike anything in his experience. "Sir, I need you to step outside while we sort this out," Martinez said to Harold, his tone respectful but official. "We'll need a full statement about what happened here." Harold nodded and began moving toward the door, his military bearing evident even in the aftermath of combat. As he passed one of the fallen robbers, the young man looked up at him with a mixture of pain, fear, and something that might have been respect. "How?" the robber gasped, still struggling to breathe normally after Harold's precise strike. "You're just an old man." Harold paused for a moment, looking down at his defeated opponent with eyes that had seen too much violence, but had learned to use it only when absolutely necessary. "Son, age is just a number when you're protecting people who can't protect themselves. I learned that lesson a long time ago in a place far from here, fighting for people I'd never met against enemies who wanted to hurt them. Today wasn't any different." As Harold stepped outside into the cool evening air, a small crowd had gathered to watch the police activity. Neighbors who had known him for years stared in amazement at the quiet veteran who had just demonstrated capabilities they never suspected he possessed. The adrenaline was beginning to wear off now, and Harold could feel his age returning as his heart rate slowly returned to normal. His arthritic joints ached from the sudden exertion, and he was breathing harder than he would have liked. But he was alive. Mrs. Murphy was safe, and 3 dangerous criminals were in custody. What Harold didn't realize was that his actions had been captured on the store's security camera system, and that footage would soon change his life in ways he could never have imagined. News of Harold Thompson's heroic actions spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. Within hours of the incident at Murphy's corner store, local reporters had gathered outside the police station where Harold was giving his statement. The story of an elderly Vietnam veteran single-handedly stopping 3 armed robbers was exactly the kind of human interest story that captured public attention. Detective Sarah Chen, who had been assigned to Harold's case, found herself impressed not just by his actions, but by his precise, detailed account of the events. Unlike many civilians involved in violent encounters, Harold's military background had trained him to observe and remember crucial details that would be vital for the prosecution. "Mr. Thompson," Detective Chen said as she reviewed his statement, "your account is remarkably thorough. Most people in your situation would be too shaken up to remember this level of detail." Harold adjusted his position in the uncomfortable plastic chair, his formal posture unchanged despite hours of questioning. "Ma'am, when you've been in combat, you learn to pay attention to everything. Lives depend on accurate information, whether you're calling in artillery coordinates or describing enemy positions. Old habits die hard," the detective nodded, understanding dawning in her expression. She had interviewed many veterans over the years and recognized the particular type of discipline that military service instilled. But Harold was different from most. His composure and clarity were exceptional even by military standards. "The security footage corroborates everything you've told us," she continued. "The way you disarmed that gunman was textbook perfect. Where did you learn techniques like that?" Harold's weathered face showed a slight smile. Special Forces training, ma'am. Green Berets don't just carry guns. We learn to fight with whatever tools are available, including our bare hands. The Army figured if we were going to be dropped behind enemy lines, we better know how to handle ourselves in close quarters. Outside the police station, word of Harold's military background had reached the local Veterans of Foreign Wars post. Commander William Torres, a Gulf War veteran who had served as the post's leader for the past 5 years, arrived with several other members to offer support to their fellow veteran. "We came as soon as we heard," Commander Torres told Detective Chen when she stepped outside for a break. "Harold Thompson has been a member of our post for over 20 years, but he never talks much about his service. We knew he was Special Forces, but he's always been modest about his record." The commander's voice carried deep respect as he continued, "What that man did today doesn't surprise those of us who know him. He's the kind of soldier who would walk into hell to help a fellow human being. The Army trained him to be a warrior, but his heart made him a protector." Back inside the station, Harold was finishing up his paperwork when Mrs. Murphy arrived, accompanied by her daughter and son-in-law. The elderly shopkeeper's eyes were still red from crying, but her expression was one of profound gratitude mixed with concern for the man who had saved her life. "Harold Thompson, you beautiful man," she said in her thick Irish accent, wrapping the veteran in an unexpected hug. "I've been worried sick about you sitting in this police station all afternoon. Are you hurt? Did those terrible boys injure you?" Harold gently patted the emotional woman's back, uncomfortable with the attention but touched by her concern. "I'm fine, Mrs. Murphy. Just a few sore muscles that'll remind me I'm not 25 anymore. How are you holding up?" "Holding up?" She laughed through her tears. "Harold, I've never been prouder to know someone in my entire life. When that gun was pointed at you, I thought I was about to watch a good man die trying to protect me. But you moved like lightning, like some kind of action movie hero." Her daughter, Patricia, stepped forward with her own expression of amazement. "Mr. Thompson, I've heard my mother talk about you for years. She always said you were a gentleman and a good customer. But we had no idea you were, well, that you could do what you did today." Harold shifted uncomfortably under the praise. Throughout his military career and his civilian life afterward, he had never been comfortable with attention or accolades. He had always believed that doing the right thing was simply what decent people did, nothing more. "Mrs. Murphy has always been kind to me," Harold replied simply. "When someone threatens a good person like that, you step up. It's not complicated." Detective Chen rejoined the group, carrying Harold's personal effects that had been processed as potential evidence. "Mr. Thompson, you're free to go. The district attorney's office will be in touch about testifying when these cases go to trial. But for now, you're done here." As they walked out of the police station together, Harold noticed the crowd of reporters and camera crews that had gathered outside. The sight made him visibly uncomfortable, and he instinctively tried to shrink back into the building. "Oh my," Mrs. Murphy observed. "Looks like you're famous, Harold." One of the reporters, a young woman from the local television news station, approached with her camera operator in tow. "Mr. Thompson, I'm Jessica Rivera from Channel 7 News. Could we get a quick interview about what happened today?" Harold shook his head politely but firmly. "I appreciate your interest, miss, but I'd rather not. I just did what anyone should do in that situation." But the reporter persisted, sensing a compelling story. "Sir, what you did today was extraordinary. Our viewers would love to hear from a real American hero about how military training prepared you for civilian situations like this." The word hero made Harold visibly uncomfortable. He had known real heroes in Vietnam, men who had died saving their fellow soldiers, men whose names were carved into black granite walls. He didn't consider himself worthy of such praise for doing what his conscience demanded. "Ma'am, the real heroes didn't come home," Harold said quietly, his voice carrying decades of survivor's guilt. "I just did my duty as I saw it. Nothing more." Commander Torres stepped forward, recognizing his fellow veterans' discomfort with the attention. "Folks, Mr. Thompson has had a long day. Maybe we should let him get some rest." As the group prepared to leave, Harold noticed one more figure approaching from across the street. The man was tall and distinguished, wearing an expensive suit that marked him as someone of importance. When he got closer, Harold could see military bearing in his posture and a small pin on his lapel that identified him as a veteran. "Mr. Thompson?" the stranger called out. "My name is Colonel James Mitchell, United States Army, retired. I wondered if I might have a word with you." Colonel Mitchell's approach commanded immediate respect from everyone present. His bearing, his crisp uniform of civilian clothes worn with military precision, and the authority in his voice marked him as someone accustomed to leadership. Harold instinctively straightened his posture, recognizing a superior officer even in retirement. "Colonel," Harold acknowledged with a slight nod that carried decades of military protocol. "How can I help you, sir?" Mitchell studied the elderly veteran with the practiced eye of someone who had spent a career evaluating soldiers. What he saw impressed him. Despite the afternoon's trauma and hours of police questioning, Harold maintained his composure and dignity. "Sergeant Thompson," the colonel said, using Harold's former rank with intentional respect, "I represent a private security consulting firm that specializes in training corporate executives and high-profile individuals in personal protection. We're always looking for qualified instructors with your particular skill set." Harold blinked in surprise. It had been decades since anyone had called him by his military rank, and the job offer was completely unexpected. "Sir, I appreciate the thought, but I'm 73 years old. My fighting days are behind me." Colonel Mitchell smiled, gesturing toward the police station where Harold had just finished giving his statement about neutralizing 3 armed criminals. "From what I understand about today's events, your fighting days are far from over. The techniques you used were flawless, and your tactical decision-making under pressure was exemplary." Mrs. Murphy, who had been listening to the conversation with growing excitement, stepped forward enthusiastically. "Harold, this sounds like a wonderful opportunity. You could teach people how to protect themselves the way you protected me." The colonel nodded approvingly at her words. "Mrs. Murphy is absolutely right. There's a growing need for experienced professionals who can teach practical self-defense and situational awareness. Your military background combined with today's demonstration of skill makes you an ideal candidate." Harold remained skeptical. He had spent the years since his military service working modest jobs and living quietly on his pension. The idea of suddenly becoming an instructor to wealthy executives seemed surreal. "Colonel Mitchell, I'm flattered, but I'm not sure I'm the right person for that kind of work. I'm just a regular guy who happened to be in the right place at the right time today." Detective Chen, who had been observing the conversation, decided to interject. "Mr. Thompson, I've been a police officer for 12 years and I've never seen civilian response like what you demonstrated today. The way you assessed the threat, controlled the situation, and neutralized multiple armed suspects was absolutely professional." Commander Torres from the VFW post added his voice to the growing chorus of supporters. "Harold, you've been hiding your light under a bushel for too long. Today proved that your skills and experience are too valuable to waste. Maybe it's time to step back into a position where you can make a difference." The colonel sensed Harold's hesitation and decided to address his concerns directly. "Sergeant, I understand your reluctance. Many veterans struggle with the transition from service to civilian life, feeling like their military skills aren't relevant anymore. But what you demonstrated today proves that training never really leaves you." Harold looked around at the faces of people who had gathered to support him. Mrs. Murphy with her grateful tears, Detective Chen with her professional respect, Commander Torres with his fraternal pride, and Colonel Mitchell with his offer of purpose. For the first time in years, he felt truly valued for who he was and what he had learned through decades of service. "What would this job involve, sir?" Harold asked, his curiosity beginning to overcome his initial reluctance. Colonel Mitchell's expression brightened at the question. "We provide security training to corporate executives, government officials, and private citizens who face elevated threats. You would teach situational awareness, basic self-defense, and emergency response procedures. Your military background and today's real-world demonstration make you uniquely qualified." The offer represented more than just employment. It was a chance for Harold to feel useful again, to share the knowledge and skills that had defined much of his life. After years of quiet retirement, the prospect of meaningful work was unexpectedly appealing. "The compensation would be substantial," the colonel continued. "We're talking about a salary that would triple your current pension, plus benefits and the opportunity to work with some very interesting people. You'd be based here locally, but there might be occasional travel for specialized training sessions." Mrs. Murphy clapped her hands together excitedly. "Harold, this is perfect. You could help people learn to protect themselves just like you protected me, and you deserve to be properly compensated for your skills and experience." Harold felt a stirring of excitement that he hadn't experienced in years. The idea of teaching others, of passing on the knowledge that had served him so well, appealed to something deep in his character. Military service had taught him that skills and knowledge were meant to be shared, not hoarded. "I would need to think about it, sir," Harold said carefully. "This is a big decision, and I want to make sure I could do the job justice." Colonel Mitchell reached into his jacket and pulled out a business card. "Of course. Take all the time you need, but I hope you'll consider it seriously. Men with your combination of training, experience, and proven judgment are rare. Today you demonstrated that you still have a lot to offer." As the group began to disperse, Harold found himself looking at the business card with growing interest. The company name, Guardian Elite Training Solutions, sounded professional and serious. The address was in an upscale part of the city, and the contact information included multiple phone numbers and an impressive website. Detective Chen approached him one final time before leaving. "Mr. Thompson, I hope you take that job. The world needs more people with your sense of duty and your skills. Today you prove that age is just a number when you have the right training and the right heart." Harold nodded gratefully at her words. As he finally made his way to his old pickup truck, he realized that this day had changed everything about his life. What had started as a routine trip to buy groceries had transformed him from an invisible old veteran into someone whose skills and experience were suddenly in demand. For the first time in years, Harold Thompson felt like he had a future worth looking forward to. The quiet retirement that had stretched endlessly before him was suddenly filled with new possibilities and purpose. 3 months after the incident at Murphy's Corner Store, Harold Thompson stood in front of a conference room filled with corporate executives from a major technology company. Gone was the quiet, almost invisible old man who had shuffled through his neighborhood shopping for groceries. In his place stood a confident instructor wearing professional attire, radiating the same calm authority that had saved Mrs. Murphy's life. Situational awareness, Harold told his students, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had learned these lessons in life and death situations, is not paranoia. It's simply paying attention to your environment and trusting your instincts when something doesn't feel right. The executives, accustomed to boardroom meetings and corporate presentations, found themselves hanging on every word from this elderly veteran, who spoke with quiet conviction about personal safety. Harold's teaching style was unlike anything they had experienced. Direct, practical, and backed by real-world experience that commanded respect. Guardian Elite Training Solutions had proven to be everything Colonel Mitchell had promised and more. Harold's first month on the job had been challenging as he adjusted to working with civilian students rather than military personnel. But his natural teaching ability and wealth of experience quickly made him one of the company's most requested instructors. "Let me tell you about a situation I encountered recently," Harold continued, using the Murphy's Corner Store incident as a teaching tool without dwelling on his own heroic actions. An elderly woman was being threatened by 3 armed criminals. The situation could have ended in tragedy, but proper awareness and decisive action changed the outcome entirely. One of the executives, a young woman named Sarah who managed cybersecurity for her company, raised her hand. "Mr. Thompson, how do you maintain that kind of calm under pressure? I freeze up when someone honks their car horn at me." Harold smiled, remembering his own early days in the military when stress and fear had seemed overwhelming. "Ms. Chen, courage isn't the absence of fear, it's action in spite of fear. The key is training yourself to respond automatically, so your body knows what to do even when your mind is racing." The transformation in Harold's life had been remarkable. His newfound purpose had energized him in ways he hadn't felt since his military service. The arthritis that had slowed his movement seemed less noticeable when he was engaged in meaningful work, and his confidence had returned in full measure. Colonel Mitchell had been right about the compensation as well. Harold's salary from Guardian Elite had allowed him to move from his modest apartment to a comfortable house with a small yard. More importantly, the work had given him a sense of value and contribution that had been missing from his retirement years. After the training session ended, Harold gathered his materials while the executives filed out, many stopping to shake his hand and thank him for the valuable lessons. The respect in their eyes reminded him of how his fellow soldiers had looked at him during his military service, recognition of competence and experience, earned through dedication and sacrifice. Colonel Mitchell appeared in the doorway as Harold finished packing his briefcase. The colonel's expression showed the satisfaction of a man whose judgment had been thoroughly validated. Outstanding work as always, Sergeant. The client feedback has been exceptional. They specifically requested you for their advanced training next month. Harold nodded with quiet pride. Thank you, sir. I have to admit I wasn't sure about this job at first, but it feels good to be useful again. You're more than useful, Mitchell replied. You're inspirational. These corporate executives come in thinking they know about leadership and decision-making, but you show them what real leadership looks like under pressure. That's invaluable. The drive home took Harold through his old neighborhood, past Murphy's corner store where everything had changed 3 months earlier. The store had been renovated since the robbery, with new security cameras and reinforced glass, but Mrs. Murphy still greeted him with the same warmth whenever he stopped by. Tonight, however, Harold noticed something different as he pulled up to the store. A small crowd had gathered outside, and there was a sense of celebration in the air. Curious, he parked his truck and walked over to investigate. "Harold," Mrs. Murphy called out excitedly when she spotted him. "Perfect timing. Come see what the city council decided to do." She led him to the front of the store where a new bronze plaque had been mounted next to the entrance. The inscription read, "On this site, Harold Thompson, United States Army veteran, demonstrated extraordinary courage in protecting an innocent citizen from armed criminals. His actions remind us that heroism comes not from seeking glory, but from doing what is right when others are in danger." Harold stared at the plaque in stunned silence, overwhelmed by the unexpected honor. He had specifically asked that his actions not be sensationalized or turned into publicity, but this tribute felt different, respectful and meaningful rather than exploitative. "The whole neighborhood pitched in for this," Mrs. Murphy explained, her voice thick with emotion. "We wanted people to remember what you did, not just the violence of that day, but the courage and decency you showed." Commander Torres from the VFW post stepped forward from the crowd. "Harold, we've also arranged for something special. The mayor is presenting you with the city's Medal of Valor next week. It's the highest civilian honor we can give." The gathered neighbors began to applaud, but Harold held up his hand, uncomfortable with the attention as always. "Folks, I appreciate this more than I can say, but what happened that day wasn't about me. It was about standing up for someone who needed help. Any of you would have done the same thing." "But we didn't do it," said Patricia, Mrs. Murphy's daughter, stepping forward with tears in her eyes. "You did. And because of that, my mother is still alive. Those criminals are in prison and our neighborhood is safer." Detective Sarah Chen, who had been investigating a nearby case, noticed the commotion and joined the group. "Mr. Thompson, I'm glad I ran into you. I wanted you to know that all 3 suspects took plea deals. They'll be serving significant prison time, and they specifically mentioned that your actions made them realize they needed to change their lives." Harold absorbed this information with mixed feelings. He was glad the criminals were being held accountable, but he also hoped they would use their time in prison to genuinely reform themselves. As the crowd began to disperse, Harold found himself standing alone with Mrs. Murphy in front of the store that had become the turning point of his life. The elderly shopkeeper took his arm with the familiarity of someone who had shared a life-changing experience. "Harold Thompson," she said in her Irish accent. "That day when you walked into my store, I thought I was going to witness the end of a good man's life. Instead, I got to see the beginning of something wonderful. You found your purpose again, haven't you?" Harold looked at the bronze plaque, then at the woman whose life he had saved, and finally at the neighborhood he had called home for so many years. For the first time since leaving the military, he felt truly at peace with who he was and what he had accomplished. "Mrs. Murphy," he said with a smile that reached his eyes, "I think I finally have. It just took me a while to realize that a soldier's duty doesn't end when the uniform comes off. Sometimes the most important battles are fought in grocery stores, protecting people who matter." As Harold drove home to his new house, he reflected on how dramatically his life had changed. The quiet, forgotten veteran who had felt invisible and useless had discovered that his skills, experience, and character were more valuable than ever. The incident at Murphy's corner store hadn't just saved one elderly woman. It had rescued Harold Thompson from the obscurity of purposeless retirement and restored his sense of meaning and worth. Tomorrow he would teach another class, sharing his knowledge with people who needed to learn how to protect themselves and others. Next week he would receive a medal recognizing his courage. But tonight, Harold was simply grateful for the chance to serve again, to matter again, and to prove that heroism isn't about age or recognition. It's about standing up when standing up is needed, regardless of the consequences. The old soldier had found his mission again, and it felt exactly like coming home.